Hello, Hadran. It is very lovely to be back with you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, this night, depending on where in the world you are. And welcome to part 2 of Introduction to Aggada. Some technicalities. Once again, thank you to you lovely people who have left your cameras on, so I'm not shouting into a void. I'm going to ask that Maggie share a link to the sources that we're going to use today. I will also be sharing my screen, although at some point you will need those sources. So Maggie, when you have a moment, please do go ahead and share that link. And I will be asking for reader volunteers. So if you would like to read at the right moment, please press your electronic hand, and Maggie can give you magical powers with which to unmute yourself. Finally, I will be asking questions and expecting brilliant answers. I also welcome your questions to me. We're going to, at this stage, for most of the class, please limit your questions and comments to the chat box. I will ask Maggie to bring to my attention anything that is necessary and urgent during the course of the class, and then I promise to leave time at the end for a more oral Q&A. And one more thing I'd like to add, if you will allow me. It's been a very difficult day today in Israel. We buried 4 of our soldiers who gave their lives so that I and many people like me can sit comfortably in our homes and learn Torah, and so I'd like to dedicate our learning together to their Aliyat Neshama. And with that, a bit of a recap as to what we did last week before we dive into what we are about to do this week. So we started last week with a bit of theory. We spoke about the main definition of Aggada as a meta-genre. Aggada scientifically is basically not halacha. We spoke about the different subgenres that are included under this negative definition. We spoke about the different types of content. We spoke about the different works in which we will find Aggada, the different rabbinic works. And then we spoke a little bit about the history in which these stories were read and more often than not misread throughout Jewish history. And then how in the 20th century we turned toward Aggada as literature and why this has led to an explosion in the field, both in scholarship and in popularity. And then we went from theory to practice and demonstrated it, or began to demonstrate it, on the fairly popular story of Heruta from Kiddushin 81b. And let's just refresh our memories by rereading the story, because this is what we're going to work on today. So can I have a volunteer reader, please, before I share my screen? If you'd like to volunteer to read, please press your electronic hand. Pepita. Anita, you'll be next. Thank you, Pepita. I'm going to share my screen, and we're just going to reread the story once again to refresh our memories. Take it away, Pepita, please.
It was Rabbi Chaya bar Ashi's custom, whenever he prostrated himself, to say, "May the merciful one save me from the evil inclination." One day his wife heard him. She said, "For many years he has separated himself from me. Why does he say this?" One day he was studying in his garden. His wife made herself up and passed before him repeatedly. He said to her, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm Heruta, and I just returned today." He demanded her services. She said to him, "Bring me the pomegranate from the top of that tree." He jumped up, went, and brought it to her. When he came home, his wife was firing the oven. He went and sat in it. She said to him, "What is this?" He said, "Such and such happened." She said, "It was me." He paid no attention to her until she gave him the signs. He said to her, "Nevertheless, my intention was to violate a prohibition." That righteous man fasted all of his days until he died of that death.
Thank you. I noted how this is a fairly popular story in the Talmud. A great deal has been written and said about it. And so we began last week by looking at the 3 main interpretive thrusts that have been given to the story. The first, traditional reading by the great medieval commentator Rashi, who says this is a story of an elderly couple who are past their sexual prime. And the story is about how the wife, through the means of disguise as the prostitute Heruta, reawakens lost desire. And we spoke about how, with tremendous respect to Rashi, that reading doesn't quite fit with the narrative details. And so we set that to one side. We moved to a second modern reading, the one belonging to Shulamit Valo. Shulamit Valo reads the story within its immediate context of a story cycle in Tractate Kiddushin, where one rabbi after the next finds himself seduced and nearly destroyed by the devil in disguise. And Valo contends that our story is simply more of the same, except in this story, the disguise of the devil is the rabbi's own flesh and blood wife. And we spoke about, again, with respect to Valo, although the story is quite similar to the stories that come before it, it is also different in some very significant ways, and it cannot be read as simply more of the same. And then we move to the third, and in my mind, the most interesting reading, belonging to Shlomo Ne'er, who reads the story in its historical context as a rabbinic anti-Christian polemic, a rabbinic polemic against the Christian ideal of abstinence. The idea is the rabbis are telling us a cautionary tale. If you try, like Avchia, to abstain from your lawfully wedded wife, you will end up like Avchia, sinning with a prostitute. And we mentioned how this works quite nicely both within the historical context, because Jews at the time were actually taken in by this Christian ideal of abstinence and adopting it as their own. And it works within the broad context of rabbinic literature, where we have quite a few what scholars call bed trick tales, where women manage to trick men through the means of disguise into having sexual relations with them. And so this is a really compelling reading. Not for nothing, it is the most popular reading of the story of Heruta. Many, many readers follow it, and I would like to question it. As I said at the very end of last week's class, I find it rather difficult to believe that Rav Chia bar Ashi, not a simple Jew, but actually a very senior rabbi, ahead of his local yeshiva in Kokonia, where he lived, that this senior rabbi would elect to violate a basic biblical command because it is biblically mandated that a husband have relations with his wife at regular intervals. Seems to me to be highly unlikely. Even less likely is that the wife, until the very beginning of the story, for many years, seems to do absolutely nothing about this blatant violation of her marriage contract. And what for me is perhaps the most suspect is Seir Rav Chia, taken in by this Christian ideal, spends many years waging holy war against his evil inclination. Why is it that such a man would fall so immediately at the very sight of a prostitute without so much as a hint of resistance? And so it's a really good reading. I think we can do one better. And by we, I mean all of you, because this is what you are about to do today. And here I get to the crux of this course. I promised you last week that the main objective of this course was to empower you to read and unpack these stories on your own. And I'd like to begin with that. As I said last week, one of the great things of Aggada in the early 21st century is that it is very, very widely read, more widely than ever before in Jewish history. One of the bad things about Aggada in the 21st century is that it is very, very widely misread. Because these stories seem to be very simple, very accessible. As I said last week, they read like simple folk tale. Many is the reader who reads it and thinks they understand when they absolutely do not. And here is a thing to know. One of the hallmarks of rabbinic storytelling is what I call in my book the false front. What these stories appear to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite to one another. The rabbis compose their stories so as to deliberately mislead us, such that if we only read them once, we will come away with the wrong idea. And so Talmudic stories can never just be read, they must always be reread. But it is not enough to reread technically another time. There is a very particular set of rules which we have to apply to our rereading if we're going to break through this false front and uncover the deeper meaning that lies hidden between the lines. The good news is it's a short and not terribly complicated list, and I will share it with you now. And so this is the rule of thumb, and you get to take this home and basically have it and hold it and love it for the rest of your lives. And this should guide you in your reading of basically any story, and rabbinic stories in particular. The rule of thumb is this, and if you remember nothing else from this course, remember this. To read a story in the Talmud, any story in the Talmud, particularly rabbinic legend, which is the subgenre to which this course is dedicated, there are exactly two things we need to do. We need to zoom in and do a close reading of the text, and we need to zoom out and look at the context. That's it. Very simple. If you have that nailed, you can go home if you really want to now. But if you're still here, I'm going to break these rules down. And at this point, because very shortly after we go through these rules, Maggie is going to throw you into breakout rooms and you're actually going to work on these rules yourselves. If anything I say is unclear, please do put a question in the chat box, and then Maggie can bring them to my attention and I can answer them beforehand. Also, just on a technical level, if there's anyone you really, really want to be in your Heruta group, send Maggie a private message and she will do her best, no promises, to accommodate. And so with that, zoom in and do a close reading of the text. You remember I said last week that rabbinic storytelling, Aggada, is literature. It was composed as literature, and it is as literature that it ought to be read. And so we have to read it as we would any other novel, short story, or play. And this final genre of a play is perhaps the most relevant because rabbinic legends are fundamentally scenic. They present their plot directly in dialogue and action, and mediated by long descriptions of scenery or characters, which gives the reader the sense of watching a drama enacted on a stage. In fact, the best way to read these stories is envision them as if they are being enacted on a stage, and think to yourself, if I was directing this, how exactly would I direct it? And so what we need to do essentially is break the story down into its literary building blocks. This is rubric A on the slide in front of you. 1, structure. We want to break the story up into acts, and when more relevant, the acts further into scenes. If you have trouble doing this, again, think of this as if it's a play enacted on a stage. Every time you envision the lights going down or the the lights going out or the curtain coming down, that will be a new act. And we will see the rabbinic legends tend toward a 3-act drama. So that is a bit of a clue. 2, setting. We have to determine where and when the story takes place. Now, I mean where and when on the macro. Where is it geographically and when is it historically? For instance, the story of Heruta, I already told you, takes place in the 3rd century in the small Jewish community of Konya. But also for each act, I want you to try and figure out, when is it? Is it daytime or nighttime? Is it midweek or Shabbat? Is it winter or summer? Do we know? When is it? Sorry, where is it? Are we indoors or outdoors? If we are indoors, is this a public or private space? If we're outdoors, what kind of outdoor space it is? And that will help you break the story down into acts as well, because every time the setting changes, that will generally be regarded as a new act. 3, characters. For every act, who are the people in the act? And here again, very much like in a play, I tend to count as characters only those who have speaking parts. If there are people who are just hanging out on the stage, I don't count them as characters unless they actually have something significant to say or do. Who are the characters in each act or scene? How are they presented to us? What are their personality traits? What are their ideologies? What are their relationships to one another? Relationships are a key theme in rabbinic storytelling, so you know they're going to be important. Does anyone change? Generally, the character that changes the most will be the hero or heroine of the story. Do the relationships to one another change? And we will find both in setting and in characters, the setting will generally be in a condensed time and space. They're not these big epic moves in space or in time. And the character will be a very limited cast of characters, which gives the whole story an air of immediacy and intensity. Next, plot. Follow the storyline through. Try and figure out, again, I apologize, it's a lot of theory, but you need this because you're about to put this into practice. Try and figure out why the story develops in the particular way that it does. Look out for parallels, for turning points, for climaxes. Very much like the setting and the characters, the plot of rabbinic stories will be very compressed, very taut, and thereby highly dramatic. And then finally, themes, symbols, and motifs. We have to look in the story for any kind of underlying theme. What is the story really about? Any kind of repeated words. By the way, if you want to find repeated words and you were able to read the story in the original Hebrew or Aramaic, that will help because sometimes the translation doesn't bear it out correctly. Are there any elements that seem symbolic, that seem to point to some deeper idea? This is going to be the surest way to break through the story's false front and to get from the text to the subtext, to uncover the story's hidden truth. So that is basically what we have to do in our close reading. Maggie, I'm going to pause now for questions. If there are any questions, could you please just put them for me in the chat and I will try and answer them as best I can. Why did the rabbis choose the false front? Diane, that is such a fantastic question. It is so important that I actually end my book by discussing it. And likewise, I'm going to ask you to hold that question until the very end of next class, which will be the end of this course, and ask it again then, because that will probably be a very good way to end the course for all of us, okay? Where is Kolkonia? It is in Babylon. All right, the next thing we need to do is we need to zoom out and look at the context. The Talmud itself is full of rabbis doing close reading of generally biblical verses, where other rabbis will retort by saying, "Fool, cast your eye to the end of the verse." Meaning it's not enough to read the verse closely, you have to read it in its context. And rabbinic stories specifically come to us nestled within various layers of context, and we have to consider them each one in turn, and these are concentric circles. Let's begin with the immediate context. The immediate context is the sugya. Rabbinic stories do not appear in isolation. In the Talmud, they'll come to us as part of a sugya. A sugya is a unit of Talmudic discussion. As I said last week, sometimes they'll come on the heels of a halachic conversation, where they will illustrate a particular halachic point. They will clarify a particular halachic point. Sometimes they will even subvert a halachic point or call it into question. Other times, a story will follow other stories. We saw that in the particular story we're looking at now, the story of Heruta, that comes to us as part of a story cycle. Either way, whether a story follows halacha or Aggada, the way that it is framed by the Talmudic editors is often a very deliberate choice. And it has direct ramifications for how we read the story. 2. This is the broader context of the rabbinic corpus. If we zoom out even further, we have to consider the story not within its immediate context in the Talmud, but actually within the broad context of all of the Talmud, and even more broadly in the context of all of rabbinic literature. Breaking the story down into its literary components is not enough. We have to understand what each of these literary components mean in the rabbinic imagination. So for every element that we identified in our close reading, we have to find how that element acts in similar stories told by the rabbis. For instance, setting. If a story is set in twilight, or in Yom Kippur, or during the destruction of the Second Temple, all of these times mean something in the rabbinic imagination. And to understand exactly what that means, we have to read other stories that are set in the same time. Place. If a story takes place on a ship, or in the desert, or in a courthouse. All these spaces mean something similarly in the rabbinic imagination, and we have to read stories set in similar spaces. Characters. If the story is about Rabbi Akiva, or Bruria, or Rav Kahana, or a washerman, or a Roman matron, all of these characters mean something to the rabbis, and we have to read other stories about the same characters. And this is very, very important, because when the rabbis tell us a story about a particular character, they assume that we know the other stories told about the same character, and that we bring that knowledge to bear on this particular story. And so we have to know these things. I'll say in just a moment exactly how we know these things. Plot. Every plot element. If this is a story of seduction, which is the case in our story, if it's a story about a deathbed scene or the giving of charity, each one of these plot elements, again, means something, and we have to read similar stories with similar plot elements to understand exactly what. And then finally, themes, symbols, motifs. If the story features a mirror or a lamp or a snake, these motifs mean something to the rabbis, and we have to search rabbinic literature for appearances of the motifs elsewhere. The best way to do this, well, I don't know, the easiest way to do this is Sefaria has a great search app, and you simply type the particular word or name into the search function. If you can copy paste the original Hebrew or Aramaic, that is better still, because you don't want to rely on translations. And you pull up all the other places within the Talmud where that particular element appears. So that is the broad context of rabbinic literature. Next, we zoom out even further and we look at world literature. And that is because the rabbis did not operate in a vacuum. Like Jews throughout history, they were deeply influenced by the cultures in which they found themselves, specifically the Greco-Roman culture to the west and the Persian culture to the east. And so if a story, for instance, features a snake, sometimes it is not enough to see how snakes function within rabbinic literature. Sometimes we might want to look at how snakes are featured within Greek myth or Persian folklore, for instance. I'll say a little more about world literature a bit later on toward the end of today's class. And then finally, zooming out even further, we have to consider the historical context. Now you might say, what do you mean historical context? You told us last week that these stories are not historical. And you'd be right. These stories are not historical, but they are set in a particular historical reality. A reality which is removed from us by a good millennium and a half. Again, as I mentioned last week, the reality depicted in these stories, more often than not, is not the reality of the characters, but the reality of the storytellers. And the storytellers are the final editors of the Talmud, who lived roughly 1500 years ago. And we can never, ever assume that any detail, any historical circumstance depicted in these stories is in any way like our own. For instance, one great Talmudic scholar, whose work I very much admire, writes about the story of Heruta, when Rav Chia bar Ashi's wife says to herself, for many years he has separated himself from me. Why does he say this? She writes this very heartbreaking description of how the wife looks at herself in the wall mirror and she sees all the wrinkles on her face and she says, yeah, I'm really old. No wonder my husband doesn't love me anymore. Which is really heartbreaking. It is also really incorrect. Because in Talmudic times, they did not have wall mirrors. They only had handheld mirrors. And this great Talmudic scholar is making the mistake of projecting her own reality onto the reality of the Talmud, which we must never, ever do. And to make sure that we do not make that mistake, we have to familiarize ourselves with the social conventions, the political climate, the cultural mores, the economic structures, the scientific knowledge, and the material objects of the rabbinic world. And then finally, there are three reading hypotheses which we have to bring to bear on these stories when we read them. One, omnisignificance. The stories of the Talmud, as I just mentioned, are very terse, they're very compact. There are whole worlds of drama held together in three short lines, meaning they are minimalist. There are various interesting reasons as to why these stories are so Minimalistic, the main one, is that these stories were created as oral texts, and they had to be transmitted for many generations orally, which means they had to be commended to memory, so they were boiled down to their barest of bones. Which means that we have to look closely at each and every sentence, clause, and individual word. This is not unlike the way we would read biblical verses. We have to assume that every single unit of text is there for a reason. Nothing in these very carefully crafted stories is redundant. That's one. Two, interiority. Because these stories are scenic, because they are written like plays, they tell us what characters say and do, but not what they think or feel. It is therefore up to us to get into the heads and the hearts of each and every character, because very much like in plays, there are as many perspectives as there are speaking parts. And it's up to us to tease out the unstated thoughts and emotions of each character. And we will see that the bulk of the drama of these stories is in the emotional subtext. Finally, I forget what I called it on this slide. What did I call it on this slide? I'm going to move. Okay, I call it axiology, or the moral of the story. Just because these stories didn't happen doesn't mean they aren't true. I'm going to say that again because that is important. Just because these stories didn't happen doesn't mean they aren't true. There is a great truth to these stories, but it is a moral truth, a philosophical truth, a spiritual truth, not a historical truth. The rabbis told their stories, as I said last week, not to record history, but rather to teach us, quote, how to know God and cleave to his ways, if you remember the rabbinic description of Aggada from last week. And so the ultimate question which you must ask yourselves upon reading the Talmudic stories is why are the rabbis telling us this story? What is the lesson they wish for us to learn? Those are the three reading hypotheses. Maggie, are there any questions about any of this before I tell people exactly what I would like for them to do? So I see one question, which is the last one left in the chat. Where do we get the information of context? So within rabbinic literature, as I said, use the Safari search function. Within world literature, there is a great index that you can find online called the Arne Thompson Index. And again, I'm going to apologize if you send me PMs. I can barely read the general chat, and I can't quite read the direct messages. I apologize. As always, I'm going to put my email in the chat at the end of today's class, and you can email me if there's anything you'd like to discuss. There is an index whose name I will put in the chat for those of you who are interested, called Arne Thompson. It's basically an index of all European folk tales and all the motifs used in these folk tales, and that is a good way to see if there are any other stories out there about, say, I don't know, a husband who is tricked by his wife, for instance. With regards to rabbinic history, Google's your friend. There are no shortcuts about that. In as much as I'm an expert, I just Google a lot. And the more you read about rabbinic world, the more you know. And half of you are doing the DAF anyway, which means you're probably bigger experts than I am. All right, so you are going to take these reading rules now, and you are going to put them into practice. And I'm going to ask you to take a moment. Maggie, if you could share the link one more time in the chat box so that people can actually click on this, because I'm about to send you all away and you have to have access. Thank you very much. This is simply a very short, it's not the slides that we used last week. It's 3 very short slides. You've got the text, you've got the reading rules, and you've got a page in which you can write down your own brilliant thoughts. And what I want you to do is essentially take these rules and implement them on the story of Heruta. Once again, structure, break the story up into acts. 2, identify the setting, the time and the space or place of each of these acts. 3, identify the characters in each act. How are they presented to us? What are their character traits? What are their ideologies? What are their relationships to one another? 4, plot, follow the storyline through, try and determine why it develops in the way that it does. Look out for critical turning points, climaxes, and parallels within the plot. And finally, themes, motifs, and symbols. There are a number of recurring words, which if you read the story in the original Aramaic, you'll be able to pick up on, and those are significant. There are a number of symbols. See if you can find them and figure out what they mean. That's a close reading. Context. Here, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. And the reason is that we kind of did the context last week when we looked at the main readings of this text. Shulamit Valel, the second reading we looked at, which says this is simply another seduction story of a great rabbi by the devil in disguise, she used the immediate context of the sugya to make that point. Shlomo Naeh, who says the story is an anti-Christian polemic, reads it within the context of the historical world of the rabbis, the historical context, and the general rabbinic corpus of the bed trick story. So he too is making use of context. So I'm not going to ask you to look at context. We kind of did that already. I do, however, want to point out that notice how some of the most sophisticated, brilliant scholars of Aggada are using the very same reading rules which you've just been trained in. So I expect great things from all of you. And then finally, 3 reading hypotheses. 1, omnisignificance. Here's a clue. There is one piece of this story that seems to be redundant. If you can figure out what that piece is and why it is there nonetheless, you will have cracked the story. 2, interiority. Get into the heads of the characters and be warned this will mess with your mind. You have to figure out what he is thinking, what she is thinking, what he is thinking that she is thinking, what she is thinking that he is thinking that she is thinking. So it will mess with your mind if you do it right, and it should. And then finally and ultimately, what is the moral of the story? Why are the rabbis telling us the story? What do they wish for us to learn?